Hello and welcome, viewers, to the Podcast Stories channel. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to stay updated. Enjoy your listening experience. In a quaint, tight-knit community where time seemed to crawl and everyone was familiar with each other's lives, my parents were hardworking and modest individuals who taught me the value of loyalty and family. My father was a mechanic with hands perpetually marked by engine grease, a sign of the countless hours he spent in his workshop, fixing cars and sharing his expertise with me. Though he spoke little, his actions communicated more than words ever could. He held a deep belief in the importance of hard work, the sanctity of marriage, and the duty of a man to safeguard and support his family. My mother, on the other hand, was the soul of our household. Her smile could brighten any room, and she always had a kind word for everyone. As a homemaker, she was constantly active, cooking, cleaning, and ensuring I had everything I needed. Her unwavering love was a constant presence in my life, and I always knew she would be there for me, no matter the circumstances. From an early age, I realized that family was the most crucial aspect of life. The love my parents had for each other was visible in their everyday actions, a gentle touch as they passed by in the kitchen or the way they exchanged glances across the dinner table. They never argued in front of me, and to me, they seemed like the perfect couple. I aspired to have a marriage just like theirs when I grew up. As I matured, I began to shape my own dreams. I wanted to create a life where I could be a pillar of strength for my family, just as my father had been for us. I excelled in school, and after graduation, I chose to remain in our hometown. It might not have been the most thrilling place, but it was home, and it was where I could build the life I envisioned. It was during this time that I met Sophia. She embodied everything I had ever wished for: intelligent, ambitious, and stunning, with a smile that could captivate anyone. But it was her inner qualities that truly attracted me. Her warmth and kindness made everyone around her feel comfortable. Having grown up in a similar small town with shared values, it felt like we had known each other for a lifetime. Our relationship progressed quickly. When you find the right person, you just know. We married within a year of meeting, and it felt like the start of a fairy tale. Young and in love, we were full of aspirations for the future. I began working as a contractor, a job that kept me occupied but allowed me to provide for Sophia. She had her own career as a project manager at a marketing firm. Although her job occasionally took her away, I never minded. We were a team, and I had complete trust in her. The early years of our marriage were everything I had hoped for. We bought a modest house on the same street where I grew up, a charming, cozy home with a garden that Sophia loved. We didn't have children yet, choosing to wait until we were more settled and her career was more stable, but we were content with just the two of us. For the first few years, our marriage was everything I had hoped it would be. We bought a modest house on the same street where I had grown up, a small, cozy place with a garden that Sophia loved to tend. We didn't have children, not yet. We were waiting until we were more settled, until Sophia's career was a little more stable, but we were happy just the two of us. One of the things that made our life in that small town so special was our neighbors. People looked out for each other, and there was a real sense of community. Our closest neighbor was Karen, a single woman in her 40s who had lived next door for as long as I could remember. Karen was the kind of person you could always count on. She was friendly, always ready with a smile or a helping hand. Sophia and I often invited her over for dinner, and she did the same. There was nothing between us but friendship, a comfortable companionship that made our little street feel even more like home. One evening, a few weeks before Sophia's latest business trip, I found myself talking to Karen over the fence that separated our yards. She mentioned in passing that her microwave had broken down and she wasn't sure when she'd have the time to get a new one. It was a small thing, but I made a mental note to help her out if I could then recall Karen's birthday. Sophia was away on business, so she sent her best wishes by mail along with a small gift, a book Karen had mentioned wanting to read. It was a thoughtful gesture, but I wanted to do something a little more practical. I remembered the broken microwave and decided to surprise Karen with a new one. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a simple appliance, but I knew it would make her life a little easier. That evening, I drove to the electronics store and picked out a microwave. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, but it felt like the right thing to do. Karen had always been good to us, and this was just a small way of showing my appreciation. I knocked on her door just as the sun was setting, the box tucked under my arm. Karen opened the door with a surprised smile. "What's this?" she asked, her eyes widening as she saw the microwave. "Happy birthday," I said, handing her the box. "I remembered you saying your old one broke, so I thought this might come in handy." For a moment, she just stared at the box, and then she looked up at me with a grin. "You didn't have to do this, but thank you, really, thank you so much." She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me in a warm hug. It wasn't anything more than a gesture of gratitude, the kind of hug you'd give to a close friend. I hugged her back, feeling good about my decision. "Come in for a bit," she said as she pulled away. "Have a drink with me. We can toast to my new microwave." I hesitated for a moment, thinking about how late it was getting, but then I nodded. "Sure, why not?" Karen's house was as cozy as ours, filled with the scent of fresh coffee and something sweet baking in the oven. We sat in her kitchen, the microwave still in its box on the counter, and she poured us both a glass of wine. We toasted to her birthday, to new appliances, and to good neighbors. It was a quiet, comfortable evening. We talked about nothing in particular, her work, my latest project, the weather. After an hour or so, I finished my drink, thanked her for the company, and headed home. As I walked back to my house, I felt a deep sense of contentment. My life was good. I had a job I enjoyed, a wife I adored, and a community that felt like family. I climbed into bed that night, missing Sophia but looking forward to her return. I was completely unaware that the evening's simple kindness would soon take on a darker significance. Sophia's business trip stretched on longer than expected. She called every few days, sounding a little more tired each time. "They keep piling more work on me," she would say, laughing it off. "But I'll be home soon." I never doubted her words, why would I? Sophia had always been honest with me. If she said she was coming home soon, I believed her. But as the days turned into weeks, I started to feel uneasy. There was something in her voice during our last few calls, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, perhaps a tension or a weariness that hadn't been there before. I pushed the feeling aside, telling myself that it was just the stress of her job. Sophia was a strong woman, but everyone had their limits. She would be back soon, and everything would be fine. But the unease lingered. One night, lying in bed alone, I found myself thinking back to that evening at Karen's. It had been a nice, simple night, the kind of evening I'd had with neighbors countless times before. But now, with Sophia's absence weighing on me, I couldn't help but wonder if I had done something wrong. Had I stayed too long? Had I said something that might have been misinterpreted? The thoughts nagged at me, but I shook them off. There was no reason to doubt myself or Sophia. We had built our marriage on trust, and I wasn't going to let paranoia undermine that. The days began to blur together as Sophia's absence stretched on. I tried to keep myself busy with work, throwing myself into each project as if I could hammer and saw away the growing unease in my chest. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, the house felt emptier with each passing day. The silence was oppressive, and I found myself missing Sophia in ways I hadn't expected, not just her presence, but the small things, the sound of her humming in the kitchen, the way she'd curl up on the couch with a book, the scent of her perfume lingering in the air. Her calls became less frequent, and when she did call, the conversations were brief and rushed. "I'm just so busy, love," she would say, her voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was something more, something that set off alarms in the back of my mind. But I pushed the thoughts away, telling myself that I was being paranoid, that I was reading too much into things. One night, as I sat alone in the living room staring at the darkened TV screen, I heard a knock on the door. It was Karen, standing there with a plate of cookies and a small smile on her face. "I thought you might like some company," she said, holding out the plate. I managed to smile, grateful for the distraction. "Thanks, Karen. Come on in." She stepped inside, and for a moment, the house felt a little less empty. We sat in the kitchen, the same place where Sophia and I had shared countless meals and talked over coffee. Karen was easy to talk to, her presence soothing in a way. I hadn't expected her to ask about Sophia, but I told her the same thing I'd been telling myself, that she was just busy and would be home soon. As the conversation shifted to other topics, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a part of me that felt guilty sitting there with Karen, even though we were just talking, just friends. But it was more than that. There was an undercurrent to our conversation, a tension that hadn't been there before. It wasn't anything either of us said, but rather what was left unsaid, a lingering silence that seemed to hang in the air between us, heavy and uncomfortable. After Karen left, I found myself pacing the house, restless. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Sophia was my wife, Karen was just a neighbor, and there was nothing more to it than that. But the thoughts kept gnawing at me, feeding into the unease that had been growing since Sophia left. I tried to call Sophia that night, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a message, trying to keep my voice light and casual, just checking in, babe. Call me when you get a chance. I love you. I hung up, staring at the phone for a moment longer, hoping it would ring, that she would call back right away and reassure me that everything was fine. But the phone stayed silent. Over the next few days, the tension between Karen and me only grew. We still saw each other in passing, exchanged pleasantries over the fence, but there was a stiffness to our interactions now, a formality that hadn't been there before. I started avoiding her, finding excuses not to talk to her for too long, always rushing off somewhere else. I told myself it was because I didn't want to make Sophia uncomfortable when she got back, but deep down I knew it was because I was uncomfortable. It wasn't just Karen, though. Everything felt off. The house, once filled with warmth and light, felt cold and empty. I started sleeping on the couch, unable to bring myself to lie in our bed without Sophia beside me. The days dragged on, each one heavier than the last, until I found myself counting the hours until Sophia was supposed to be home. But as her return date drew closer, my phone rang less and less. The texts became shorter, the calls briefer, until they stopped altogether. And with each passing day, the pit in my stomach grew deeper. Then one evening, a few weeks into Sophia's extended trip, I came home to find a letter in the mail. The envelope was plain, with no return address, just my name scrawled on the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. I tore it open, my heart pounding in my chest. The note inside was short, just a few lines, but the words hit me like a punch to the gut. You think you know her, but you don't. She's not who you think she is. Look closer, and you'll see the truth. You'll find her where you least expect it. There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Who would send something like this, and why? I read the note over and over, trying to decipher its meaning, but the more I thought about it, the more confused I became. I wanted to believe it was some sort of sick joke, but the words gnawed at me, planting seeds of doubt in my mind. What if there was something I didn't know? What if Sophia wasn't who I thought she was? But that was impossible. We had been together for years, we had built a life together, and she had never given me any reason to doubt her. Still, the note lingered in my mind, refusing to be ignored. It was like a splinter, small but painful, burrowing deeper into my thoughts with each passing day. I started looking for signs, clues, anything that might explain what the note meant, but I found nothing. Everything was as it always had been. Sophia's things were still where she left them, her clothes in the closet, her books on the shelves. There was no evidence of anything out of the ordinary, but the doubt persisted, growing with each passing day. I tried to call Sophia again, but her phone was still off. The silence was deafening, and the longer it stretched on, the more I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Then one evening, a few days after the letter arrived, I came home from work to find Karen waiting for me on the front porch. She was holding a bottle of wine, a tentative smile on her face. "I thought we could have a drink," she said, her voice hesitant. "It's been a rough few weeks, and I figured you could use the company." I wanted to say no, to make some excuse, but the truth was I didn't want to be alone. The house felt too empty, too quiet, and Karen was a familiar face, a comforting presence. So I nodded, forcing a smile. "Sure, come on in." We sat in the living room, the wine flowing as we talked. At first, the conversation was light, focused on the mundane details of our lives. But as the night wore on, the tone shifted. Karen asked about Sophia, and I found myself telling her everything: the silence, the note, the gnawing doubt that had been eating away at me. Karen listened quietly, her expression sympathetic, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. When I finished, she reached out and placed a hand on my arm, her touch warm and reassuring. "You're a good man, Alex," she said softly. "You deserve to be happy. Don't let this eat you up inside." Her words were meant to comfort, but instead, they only deepened the unease I felt. I thanked her for her kindness, but when she left that night, I was more troubled than ever. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. I tried to go about my day as usual, but everything felt off, like I was living in a world that had shifted slightly, just enough to make everything seem wrong. I couldn't focus at work, my mind constantly drifting back to Sophia, to the note, to the growing sense that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Then, as if to confirm my worst fears, I received a call from Sophia's boss that afternoon. He was polite, but his tone was puzzled and concerned. "Alex, I'm sorry to bother you, but I was wondering if you had heard from Sophia recently. She hasn't been in touch for a while, and I wanted to make sure everything was okay." The blood drained from my face as his words sank in. Sophia's boss had no idea where she was. She hadn't been in touch with him, hadn't been working on any extended project. The business trip she had told me about, it was a lie. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing with questions and fears. Where was Sophia? What had she been doing all this time, and why had she lied to me? I thanked her boss and hung up the phone, my hand shaking. The truth was starting to come into focus, but it was a truth I wasn't ready to face. The woman I had built my life with, the woman I loved more than anything, she had been lying to me. And now the carefully constructed world I had lived in was beginning to crumble around me. In the days that followed, I tried to piece together the truth, but the more I searched, the more questions I uncovered. Sophia's phone remained off, her whereabouts a mystery. I tried to think back to any signs I might have missed, any clues that could explain what was happening, but there was nothing. She had been so careful, so convincing, that I hadn't seen it coming at all. The doubts that had once been small and manageable were now overwhelming, consuming my every thought. And with each passing day, the fear that I had lost Sophia for good grew stronger. The days dragged on, each one more unbearable than the last. Sophia was still gone, her phone still off, and every attempt. The attempt I made to contact her was met with silence. My mind was a battlefield of confusion and fear, the unanswered questions gnawing at me like a persistent itch. I barely slept, lying awake in the dark and imagining all the horrible scenarios that might explain her disappearance. My thoughts kept circling back to that note, those cryptic words that had shattered the fragile peace I had tried to maintain. I was on edge, jumping at every sound, every unexpected knock at the door. The world around me felt like it was unraveling, and I was powerless to stop it. It was a Friday evening, late enough that the streets were quiet, when I heard a loud, deliberate knock at the front door. My heart raced as I stood there, staring at the door as if expecting it to burst open on its own. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Swallowing my fear, I made my way to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. I opened the door, and the sight that greeted me froze the blood in my veins. Standing there were 4 men, big, rough-looking guys with hard eyes and muscles that strained against their clothes. They exuded danger, the kind of men you instinctively knew to avoid. Before I could react, before I could even take a step back, they surged forward, grabbing me with a force that knocked the breath out of me. I struggled, but it was futile, they were too strong, too fast. One of them twisted my arms behind my back with a brutal efficiency that sent a jolt of pain through my shoulders. Another shoved a gag into my mouth, cutting off any chance I had of calling for help. Panic flooded my mind as I was dragged out of my own home, my feet scraping against the floor as they hauled me out into the night. I tried to scream, tried to plead, but the gag muffled everything. They were silent professionals, their faces cold and expressionless as they manhandled me out the door and into the trunk of a waiting car. The trunk slammed shut, plunging me into darkness. The smell of gasoline and rubber filled the confined space, and I could hear the muffled voices of the men as they got into the car. The engine roared to life, and we sped off. The car's movements threw me from side to side, my heart pounding in my chest. The fear was overwhelming. I was trapped and helpless, with no idea where they were taking me or what they planned to do. Time lost all meaning in that dark, claustrophobic space. Every bump in the road, every sharp turn felt like a blow, adding to the mounting dread. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing made sense anymore. All I could do was lie there, bound and gagged, as the car sped through the night, carrying me to a fate I couldn't begin to comprehend. Eventually, the car slowed. The crunch of gravel beneath the tires signaled that we had left the main road. The vehicle came to a stop, and for a moment, everything was still. My heart pounded in the silence, my breath coming in ragged gasps around the gag. Then the trunk popped open, and I was yanked out into the cool night air. The forest surrounded us, tall trees casting long shadows in the moonlight. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. I struggled, kicking out as they dragged me deeper into the woods, but it was no use. They were too strong, too determined. They pulled me to a clearing, the moonlight casting an eerie glow on the scene. The men threw me to the ground, and before I could even try to get up, the first blow landed. Pain exploded through my side as a boot connected with my ribs, sending me sprawling. Another kick followed, then another, each one more vicious than the last. I curled up on the ground, trying to shield myself from the onslaught, but it was hopeless. They beat me with a cold, methodical brutality, their faces impassive as they stomped and punched, their anger palpable in every strike. By the time they stopped, I was barely conscious, my body a mass of pain. I lay there, gasping for breath, every movement sending fresh waves of agony through me. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. But then I heard it, a sound that cut through the fog of pain and fear, the sound of a car door opening, followed by the unmistakable click of high heels on the forest floor. I forced my eyes open, blinking against the harsh light of the moon, and saw her. Sophia. She stepped into the clearing, her silhouette bathed in silver. She was dressed in a way I had never seen her before, her outfit tight and revealing, more suited for a nightclub than for the wife I thought I knew. Her hair was done up, her makeup perfect, and she looked at me with an expression that chilled me to the bone. There was no love in her eyes, no concern, no remorse, just cold, calculating indifference. The men stepped back as she approached, their expressions shifting from aggression to something else, something closer to respect or perhaps fear. I tried to speak, to ask her what was happening, but the gag in my mouth turned my words into incoherent mumbles. Sophia didn't even glance at me as she walked past, her attention focused solely on the four men who had dragged me here. She stopped in front of them, her hand resting on her hip. For a moment, there was silence. Then, without a word, she turned to face me, her eyes locking onto mine. "Do you know why you're here, Alex?" she asked, her voice calm, almost bored. I shook my head, the movement sending fresh spikes of pain through my skull. I didn't understand any of this. How could she be here? Why was she doing this? What had I done to deserve this? Sophia smiled then, a slow, cruel smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "You think you're innocent? You think you've been the perfect husband, don't you?" Her words were like a slap to the face, the accusation sharp and cutting. I tried to shake my head, tried to tell her that I didn't know what she was talking about, but she didn't give me the chance. "You see, Alex," she continued, her voice dripping with venom, "I know about you and Karen." My heart stopped, the blood freezing in my veins. Karen? What was she talking about? There was nothing between Karen and me, nothing more than friendship. But Sophia's eyes were hard, unforgiving, and I realized with dawning horror that she believed it. She believed I had betrayed her. She nodded to the men, and without another word, she began to undress. The men watched her, their expressions darkening with lust as she stripped off her clothes, revealing a body that was all too familiar to me. My mind screamed in protest, but I was powerless to stop what was about to happen. With a slow, deliberate movement, Sophia lowered herself onto the ground in front of the men, her eyes never leaving mine. The first man stepped forward, unbuckling his belt with a grin, and in that moment, I knew what was coming. I tried to look away, tried to close my eyes, but the pain in my body and the horror of the situation kept them wide open. Sophia never once broke eye contact with me as they took turns with her, each one using her like she was nothing more than an object. She moaned and writhed, playing the part to perfection, but her eyes stayed locked on mine, filled with a hatred I had never seen before. It was a nightmare, a living hell that I couldn't escape. The woman I loved, the woman I had vowed to protect, was now being defiled in front of me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Every grunt, every slap of flesh against flesh was like a dagger to my heart, each one driving deeper than the last. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, it was over. Sophia pushed the last man off her, wiping the sweat from her brow with a look of disgust. She stood up slowly, her body glistening with sweat, and turned to face me one last time. "Now you know, Alex," she said quietly, her voice cold and detached. "Now you know what it feels like to be betrayed." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving me broken, beaten, and alone in the darkness of the forest. The sounds of the forest began to fill the silence left by Sophia and the men, the distant rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets. It all felt surreal, a stark contrast to the brutal reality I had just witnessed. I lay there, broken and battered, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The pain in my body was nothing compared to the agony in my heart. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't even cry out for help. The weight of what Sophia had done, of what she had accused me of, was crushing, suffocating. How had everything gone so wrong? The question looped through my mind, refusing to let go. I replayed every moment, every interaction, searching for the signs I had missed. How could she have thought I was unfaithful? Karen was a friend, nothing more. But as much as I tried to make sense of it, the truth was that Sophia had made up her mind. She had decided I was guilty, and nothing I could have said or done would have changed that. The pain in my ribs made it hard to breathe, but I forced myself to take shallow, ragged breaths. I needed to survive, to get out of this forest and find help. But every time I tried to move, my body screamed in protest. I was too weak, too broken, to do more than lie there, staring up at the night sky. The stars blurred as tears filled my eyes. Time passed in a haze of pain and despair. I didn't know how long I lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness, the world around me fading in and out of focus. Every now and then, I would hear a rustle in the bushes, the snap of a twig, and my heart would leap in fear, expecting the men to return and finish what they had started. But they didn't come back, and eventually, the fear gave way to exhaustion. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint sound of an engine. It was far off, barely audible over the sounds of the forest, but it was enough to snap me back to reality. I had to move. I had to get out of here. Gritting my teeth against the pain, I forced myself to sit up. The world spun around me, my vision swimming as my body protested the movement. I tasted blood in my mouth, my lips were cracked and swollen from the beating. My arms shook as I tried to push myself up, the muscles weak and uncooperative, but I couldn't give up. I couldn't let Sophia win. With a grunt of effort, I managed to get to my knees, the pain nearly blinding me. I had to stop for a moment, my head hanging as I fought to stay conscious. The gag was still in my mouth, the fabric soaked with blood and saliva, and I struggled to pull it out with my shaking hands. When it finally came free, I gasped for air, the cool night air filling my lungs and bringing with it a sliver of clarity. I needed to get to a road, find someone who could help, but the forest was dense, the trees thick and imposing, and I had no idea which direction to go. I could barely remember the route the car had taken, my mind foggy from the beating and the shock. But I had Tatri. With painstaking effort, I pushed myself to my feet, swaying unsteadily as my vision blurred again. I stumbled forward, each step sending jolts of pain through my body. The ground was uneven, the roots of the trees tripping me up as I staggered forward, my eyes fixed on the sliver of moonlight that filtered through the canopy above. I don't know how long I wandered through that forest, each step more painful than the last. The night seemed endless, the darkness closing in around me as I fought to stay upright, to keep moving. My body was on the verge of collapse, my leg threatening to give out with every step, but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't let Sophia have the satisfaction of knowing she had destroyed me completely. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, I stumbled out onto a narrow dirt road. The sight of it nearly brought me to my knees, the relief overwhelming. I had made it. I wasn't out of danger yet, but I had made it out of the forest. I leaned against a tree, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to gather my strength. The road was deserted, no sign of any cars or people, but it was something. It was hope. I didn't know where the road led, but it didn't matter. I just needed to follow it, to keep moving until I found help. I started down the road, each step a battle against the pain and exhaustion that threatened to pull me under. My mind was a blur of fear and confusion, but I kept going, one foot in front of the other, driven by the need to survive, to make sense of what had happened. As I walked, I tried to piece together the events that had led me here. The last few weeks had been a nightmare, a slow unraveling of the life I thought I knew, Sophia's extended business trip, the cryptic note, the silence that had grown between us. All of it had been building to this moment, and now I was left with nothing but questions. Why had Sophia done this? How could she believe I had cheated on her? What had happened to the woman I had loved, the woman I had married? But no matter how hard I tried, the answers eluded me. All I could see was the hatred in her eyes as she watched those men use her, the cold satisfaction on her face as she destroyed everything we had built together. It was a side of her I had never seen before, a side I couldn't reconcile with the woman I thought I knew. The road seemed to stretch on forever, each step a painful reminder of my broken body. But eventually, I saw headlights in the distance, a car approaching from far off. I tried to wave it down, but my arms were too heavy, too weak to lift more than a few inches. The car didn't stop, its lights sweeping past me as it sped down the road, leaving me in darkness once again. I nearly gave up then, my legs buckling as despair threatened to pull me under, but I couldn't give up. I had to keep going. So I pushed myself back to my feet and kept walking, each step a battle, each breath a struggle. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw a faint light in the distance, a small cabin, its windows glowing softly in the darkness. The sight of it nearly brought me to tears. I stumbled toward it, my steps uneven, my vision blurred by pain and exhaustion. When I reached the door, I pounded on it with the last of my strength, my voice hoarse as I tried to call out for help. The door opened slowly, and a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard and kind eyes stood there. His expression turned to shock as he took in my battered appearance. He said something, but I couldn't make out the words, my mind was too foggy to process anything more. I collapsed, the last of my strength leaving me as I fell into the man's arms. The world went dark, and I welcomed the oblivion. The pain finally faded as I slipped into unconsciousness. When I woke up, I was in a small bed, the smell of antiseptic filling the air. My body ached all over, every movement sending fresh waves of pain through me, but I was alive. The man who had opened the door was sitting in a chair beside the bed, a worried expression on his face. He looked up as I stirred, relief washing over his features. "You're awake," he said, his voice gentle. "We need to get you to a hospital, but the storm has knocked out the roads. You're safe here for now." I tried to speak, but my throat was too dry, my voice coming out in a croak. The man handed me a glass of water, and I drank it greedily. The cool liquid soothed my parched throat. When I finished, I tried again, my voice weak but audible. "My wife," I rasped, the words painful to say. "She did this." The man's expression darkened, a look of understanding crossing his face. "Don't worry," he said quietly. "You're safe now. We'll get you help." I nodded, the exhaustion pulling me back towards sleep. But as I drifted off, the image of Sophia's cold, calculating eyes burned in my mind, a reminder of the betrayal that had shattered my world. When I woke up again, it was daylight. The small cabin was bathed in the soft light of the morning sun, filtering in through the thin curtains. My entire body ached, the pain a constant reminder of what had happened, but I was alive. The man who had found me, his name was Tom, sat nearby sipping coffee, his eyes filled with concern as he noticed me stirring. "You're awake," Tom said, setting his mug down. "How are you feeling?" I tried to sit up, wincing as the movement sent sharp jolts of pain through my ribs and back. "I've been better," I managed, my voice still hoarse. Tom nodded, his expression sympathetic. "I figured you might want to make some calls. There's a phone over there," he said, pointing to an old landline phone on a small table. "The storm knocked out most of the power last night, but the phone line still works." The mention of the phone jolted me fully awake. I needed to call the police to report what had happened. Sophia wasn't just gone, she was on the run, and those men were dangerous. I couldn't let her get away with what she had done. With Tom's help, I dragged myself to the phone. My hands shook as I dialed 911, each number pressed sending a surge of fear through me. When the operator answered, I forced myself to stay calm, explaining everything that had happened as clearly as I could. "I need to report an assault," I said, my voice trembling. "My wife, Sophia, she's gone. I was attacked last night, taken to the woods by 4 men. They beat me up and left me there. My wife was with them, I think she's involved." The operator's voice was steady and professional. "Where are you now, sir? Are you safe?" "I'm at a cabin," I replied, glancing at Tom, who nodded in confirmation. "A man found me and brought me inside. I'm safe for now, but I need help. I need you to find her." "Help is on the way," the operator assured me. "We're dispatching officers to your location, they'll be there shortly. In the meantime, can you tell me anything else? Do you know where your wife might have gone?" I racked my brain, trying to think of where Sophia could have gone. "No," I said finally, frustration and fear seeping into my voice. "I don't know. She lied about where she was going on her business trip, and I don't know what's real anymore. She's dangerous. Please, you need to find her." "We're putting out an alert," the operator responded, her voice calm. "We'll do everything we can to locate her. Stay where you are until the officers arrive." I thanked her and hung up the phone, my hand lingering on the receiver as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Sophia wasn't just gone, she had betrayed me in the worst way possible, and now she was on the run. The woman I had loved, the woman I had vowed to protect, was now the subject of a police search. Tom stood by, his eyes filled with sympathy. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "The police will find her. Just focus on getting better." But the reassurance did little to ease the knot of fear and anger that had settled in my chest. I knew I wouldn't feel safe until Sophia was found, until those men were behind bars, and until I understood why she had done this. The hours crawled by as I waited for the police to arrive. Tom stayed with me, offering coffee and small talk to distract me from the pain and the endless questions swirling in my mind. When the knock finally came at the door, I nearly jumped out of my skin. Tom opened the door to 2 police officers, their uniforms crisp and official, bringing with them a sense of relief I hadn't realized I was waiting for. They introduced themselves and asked me to recount everything that had happened in as much detail as possible. It was agonizing reliving the nightmare as I described the attack, Sophia's cold gaze, the way she had allowed those men to degrade her right in front of me. "She's dangerous," I repeated, my voice filled with a mixture of anger and desperation. "I don't know what she's planning, but she needs to be stopped." The officers took down every word, their expressions grim as they processed the information. "We've already put out an APB on Sophia and the men you described," one of them said. "We'll find them, sir. In the meantime, Do you have anywhere safe to go? We can arrange protective custody if you feel it is at risk. I shook my head. No. I'll go home. I need to see what's left. The idea of returning to our house, the place that had once been filled with so much love and warmth but was now a crime scene, was almost too much to bear. But I had to see it. I had to know what she had done. Tom offered to drive me home, and after the police assured me they'd be in touch with updates, I accepted the ride. The drive back was quiet, the landscape passing by in a blur as I tried to brace myself for what I would find. When we finally pulled up to the house, my heart sank. The front door was slightly ajar, the lock broken. I stepped out of the car, my legs shaking as I made my way to the door, dreading what I might find inside. Pushing the door open, I stepped into the house, and my breath caught in my throat. It was completely ransacked. Drawers had been pulled out and emptied, furniture overturned, the contents of our lives scattered across the floor in disarray. Sophia had taken everything, every piece of jewelry, every valuable, every memory that we had built together, gone. My heart pounded in my chest as I walked from room to room, the devastation more complete than I could have imagined. Our bedroom was a mess, the closet empty, the bed stripped bare. She had taken it all, clothes, electronics, anything of worth. But it wasn't just the things she had stolen, it was the life we had built together, the future I had imagined with her. All of it had been stripped away, leaving behind only a hollow shell of what had once been in the living room. I found the note she had left behind, scrawled hastily on a scrap of paper and taped to the wall. You took everything from me, so I took everything from you. Don't bother looking for me, you'll never find me. Enjoy your life, Alex. Her words were like a knife twisting in my gut. I crumpled the note in my hand, rage and despair warring within me. This wasn't just about revenge, this was about destruction, about erasing everything we had been. Tom stood silently in the doorway, his presence a small comfort in the face of so much loss. I'm so sorry, he murmured, his voice heavy with sympathy. I nodded, unable to speak, as I stared at the ruins of my life. Everything I had known, everything I had trusted, was gone. Sophia had torn it all away, leaving me with nothing but the emptiness of this broken house. The police arrived shortly after, their expressions grim as they surveyed the damage. They took photos, dusted for fingerprints, and assured me that they were doing everything in their power to find Sophia. But as I stood there, surrounded by the remnants of my shattered life, I knew that it wouldn't be enough. Sophia was gone, and with her, she had taken more than just material possessions, she had stolen my trust, my faith, and the future I had once believed in. I was left with nothing but questions and the hollow ache of betrayal that no amount of justice could ever fill. The days following Sophia's disappearance and the ransacking of our home were some of the darkest I'd ever known. I lived in a state of numbness, moving through the motions of life while feeling like a ghost in my own existence. The police continued their search for Sophia and the 4 men who had brutalized me, but I didn't allow myself to hope. Hope had been crushed out of me in that forest, and I wasn't sure I'd ever regain it. I filed for divorce the very next day. It wasn't even a question, there was no going back, no possibility of reconciliation. The woman I had loved, the woman I had once thought I would spend the rest of my life with, had become a stranger, a monster. Every memory we had shared was tainted, every promise we had made shattered beyond repair. I wanted nothing more than to be rid of her, to sever any remaining ties, and move on with my life, no matter how broken that life now felt. The legal process was swift, given the circumstances. Sophia was missing, and with the evidence of her crimes piling up, the court had no trouble granting me an immediate divorce and absentia. It was a small victory, but one that did little to ease the pain or the emptiness that had settled into my soul. Weeks passed with no word from the police, each day a torturous wait for news that might never come. I stayed with Tom during that time, unable to bear the thought of returning to our empty, looted home. He was a good man, offering me a place to stay, a shoulder to lean on, and a quiet understanding that I desperately needed. But even his kindness couldn't fill the void that Sophia had left behind. Then one morning, as I sat at the kitchen table staring blankly at a cup of coffee, the phone rang. It was the lead detective on the case, his voice grim but laced with something I hadn't expected: satisfaction. "We found them," he said, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The words hit me like a jolt of electricity, pulling me out of the fog I had been living in for weeks. "Where?" I managed to ask, my voice barely more than a whisper. "A few states over," the detective replied. "They were hiding out in a rundown motel. All 5 of them, your wife and the 4 men, have been apprehended. They're in custody now." Relief, anger, and a deep, aching sadness flooded through me all at once, overwhelming in their intensity. I didn't know what to say or how to process the news. For so long, I had lived with the fear that Sophia would disappear forever, that I would never have answers, never have closure. And now, in one phone call, everything had changed. "What happens next?" I asked, my voice quivering. "They'll face charges," the detective replied with a professional tone. "We have sufficient evidence to prosecute them all: your testimony, the physical evidence from the scene, the stolen items we recovered. It's a clear-cut case. They won't escape justice." I thanked him, the words feeling empty. After hanging up, I sat motionless for a long time, staring at the wall. I should have felt something stronger: joy, satisfaction, perhaps even a sense of vindication, but all I felt was profound fatigue. The battle was over, but the wounds remained deep and painful, and I knew they would take a long time to heal. The trial was scheduled swiftly. The charges against Sophia and the 4 men grew as the investigation revealed the full scope of their crimes. They were not only guilty of what they had done to me, the men had extensive criminal records with histories of violence and theft, and Sophia had been involved in various scams and betrayals. It felt like I was learning about a completely different person, someone I had never truly known. I sat in the courtroom, surrounded by strangers, as the prosecution presented the case. I had given my testimony privately, too raw and shattered to face Sophia directly, but I needed to be there for the verdict. I needed to see justice served. Sophia appeared different in the courtroom, hollow, defeated, a mere shadow of the woman I once loved. She never looked at me, her eyes were fixed on the floor as the charges were read. The men beside her displayed a mix of defiance and indifference, but they were irrelevant to me. My focus was on Sophia, the woman who had destroyed everything we had built together. The trial was brief. The evidence was overwhelming, and the defense was weak and half-hearted. When the verdict was delivered, guilty on all counts, there was a murmur of satisfaction in the courtroom, a feeling that justice had been served. Sophia and the men received long prison sentences, their lives effectively over. They would spend the next several decades behind bars, paying for their crimes. As I left the courtroom, the gravity of it all settled on me. Justice had been served, but the victory felt empty. Sophia was gone, lost to me forever, and the life we had once shared was nothing more than a distant memory. The scars she left behind would fade with time, but they would never fully disappear. I realized that now. In the following months, I tried to rebuild my life. I moved out of the small town where we had lived, unable to bear the memories that lingered in every corner. I started anew in a different city, a small apartment where no one knew me or my past. It was a lonely existence, but it was mine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of hope. The divorce was finalized, and with Sophia behind bars, I began the gradual process of healing. It wasn't easy, and some days were tougher than others, but I kept pushing forward. I focused on small victories, getting out of bed, finding a job, making it through the day without falling apart. The nightmares still came, though less often. Over time, I would wake up in a cold sweat, the memory of that night in the forest replaying in my mind. But each time it hurt a little less, each time the wounds felt a bit less raw, and eventually, I began to live again, not the life I had planned or dreamed of, but a life nonetheless. A life where I could look in the mirror and see a man who had survived, who had endured the worst and emerged on the other side, a man who, despite everything, still believed in the possibility of happiness, in a future where the past no longer held the power to hurt him. Sophia and the men had received their due, and so had I. The justice system had fulfilled its role, and now it was up to me to do mine, to move on, to rebuild, to find a way to live with the scars they had left behind. And so I did, one step at a time, one day at a time, toward a future that was mine to shape, free from the shadows of the past.